which was an essay by Oswald Spengler on Russia, and he viewed the next great civilization would take place in Russia or on the steppe. And I began to, so it kind of rhymed and it kind of came together. And I began to take Heartland theory much more seriously and kind of used it and tested it out as a tool of analysis until eventually I came to the conclusion that actually he, despite the sort of rockets and missiles and long-range bombers, it didn't actually seem to matter. Like, it's still the same fight happening again. It seems perfectly relevant. And it also puts a kind of framework where if you think the West in this case, or as they call it, the collective West, it gives a sort of strategic logic to what they're doing, why it is that they're so interested in Ukraine, rather than, for, let's say, they're all just crazy warmongers and or you know, the various other theories that go around. But of course, then you get to think, well, are they familiar with this theory, or is it embedded within the security apparatus as a sort of received wisdom? And so this is where I began to kind of really reread it. I read the original book by Mackinder. So that's kind of a background to how I came to this.
It's quite interesting. You mentioned many things that we'll cover, and hopefully in more depth. One, of course, is the assumption by Alexander Makuris, who I think we can all agree is a rather Russian sympathetic outlet operating in London. Another, of course, is looking at this idea of Mackinder as received wisdom for the Foreign Office and the way that we approach the whole situation with Russia. Another is looking at the geography of Ukraine. As for why I believe the theory has been, quote unquote, outmoded or whatever, which you also bring up, there are several elements to it. One is the idea that Mackinder focuses a lot on land routes. In particular, this is the time of the Trans-Siberian Railway. So a lot of the dismissals towards the theory are directed against that this is no longer the case. We need to look at things like asymmetrical warfare and technological innovation. Another element to it is actually damnation by association, which is that his works influence one German Realpolitiker in the 1920s, Karl Haushofer, who then went on to influence the Lebensraum position of the German National Socialist Party, and later National Socialist Germany. That's actually an interesting angle, because I believe that damnation by association is actually looking at it completely the wrong way around. But nevertheless, that's an important element to it. There is actually one thing I wanted to bring up, which is you sent me this image of the Soviet project 903 before now, and I just wondered why in particular have you chosen to associate this image with the Heartland theory?
Because if you've got this purely land-based, again, it goes back to the Spengler sort of thesis on this, which I don't want to sort of mention again, because people will say, like, that's all I talk about. But basically, if you this kind of spirit of the Russian steppe, where it's sort of the endless horizon above the steppes. And so instead of having airplanes going sort of 5 miles high, you get this idea where everything's just flat, and it goes on forever on all sides. And in this case, this prototype, it barely sort of left this. I think they designed it to go sort of skim across the top of the Caspian. And eventually they wanted to have these things sort of just going over the steppe on little cushions of air. And it would have been like this unique form of travel, particular to the Soviet Union, or to, in case of, say, this geographic location, if you want to put it in those terms, to keep it in the stream. And then what you would begin to see is that you can have this kind of futuristic look at what it would be like to have a vast sort of dominant power, an empire, based entirely on land with its own sort of metaphysic and its own logic. And it has like more or less a complete indifference to sea routes and choke points and all of the rest of it. And it's purely about this. I think you can, we'll probably come into this later, but I think you can see elements of this with China's Belt and Road Initiative. And I think I can imagine sort of where everything is just going across land on super high tech railways, which are going like 400 miles an hour, or, you know, all of this, where everything is orientated towards getting across massive expanses of land rather than going into space, rather than traveling the sea and worrying about sea lanes. And it would have it would kind of create a whole different form of civilization if they can pull it off, of course, because you are still going to have the sea powers trying to cause trouble. But I just thought it was kind of emblematic of somebody, of a way of thinking which is different and rooted in endless flat surfaces.
And yes, you specified the aesthetic, and I very much agree with you on the on the aesthetic front, especially as it also incorporates something that Mackinder was not aware of in 1904, which is the nature of air power as well, and how such a theory could be applied, at least aesthetically, to the idea of the land view of geopolitics and history. But Oliver, I wanted to ask you the same question. How did you come across Mackinder?
Well, I've long been into geopolitics. A friend of mine gave me a book years ago, which I recommend heartily to everyone. It's called the Strategic Atlas, long out of print now, third edition, A Comparative Geopolitics of the World's Powers by one Gérard de Chalian and Jean-Pierre Rago. And in it, I first came across a listing of some of these major geopolitical thinkers. You've got early ones like Mackinder, Mahan, and you've got others like Ratzel and Kielen, Ratzel's student, both of them deriving much of their thought from groundwork laid by Ritter, and of course Kielen and Ratzel and this whole line of thinking that we can sort of call the German geostrategic thinking. Haushofer, whom you mentioned, they owe some, to some extent, some of them, the later ones, owe their thinking on the matter to Spengler, certainly insofar as they discuss the will to life of a nation, the idea of Raum or Lebensraum that you mentioned earlier. And then, of course, the sort of Anglo dimensions of it, Mahan, whom I see basically as a kind of tool for British geopolitical interests, insofar as arguably Roosevelt I, Theodore, was also sort of in that category, Mackinder, and then Speakman later. So I got into that and the reading of maps, particularly odd projections that we don't normally see, comparing map projections produced in different countries. You know, so the map that you look at on the wall of a schoolroom in China or in the United States or in Britain, they're all going to be quite different. And so how you look at these maps, what the projections show best versus other aspects that they might elide or conceal, that became a great interest to me. You know, you can't, just looking at this projection, you can't really make sense of the importance of the Arctic strategically, you know, for example. All of that was very, very interesting to me. But then when the business started in Ukraine, I believe it was someone on Twitter back in the day who pointed out to me that I should look at the Polish statesman, military figure, and strategic thinker Piłsudski and his idea of Prometheism. And much as Morgoth was talking about, saying, it's rather odd that the Heartland has one gate coming in through Eastern Europe, which led, you know, figures like Mackinder and then Speakman to talk about the importance of Eastern Europe as a gateway to the Heartland. And then I began to think, well, it's rather odd that Prometheism, with the idea of the 3 Cs initiative, it's really about seizing control of Russian access to the Baltic and the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. So I began to realize that Prometheism is entirely premised on the idea of the Heartland theory, or the developments of it later by Speakman. And there is certainly no doubt that comes down as received wisdom from the period of the Cold War through figures like Brzezinski, who argued very strongly for Prometheism, which is a kind of combination of hemming in Russia from rimland positions, as Speakman would refer to them, or this marginal crescent area, as well as attempting to lock in that part of Eastern Europe where peninsular Europe is at its narrowest point in terms of the immediate region where it adjoins Russia, that being from Kaliningrad in the north all the way down to another area that Russia has maintained control of, Transnistria. So you see these sort of 2 pincers that Russia refused to give up even after the fall of the Soviet Union, which give them a sort of 2 points to start with if they wanted to close those pincers in order to pinch off the European peninsula, if you will. So I had always been into the geopolitics, but the story of these different figures from Ritter all the way up to Speakman and Haushofer became more interesting to me as I began to follow contemporary events more closely. And lastly, I should just say and perhaps we can get into this later. Heartland theory is essentially British strategic thinking, and I can underscore, and perhaps we can get to it later, some ways in which you don't have to look at the world that way. And I think to the extent that it is British, the geostrategic thinking, and it has been carried over to the United States, I think that shows the way in which the same people who were behind the scenes in terms of British Empire, British power projection, and the rest remain behind the scenes today in the United States, which is not to say that, King Charles is in charge of the United States or something, or that secretly everything is run out of the city of London. But the general thinking about how to approach power projection and global control to the extent it can be affected is very much a British inheritance.
Can I speak to that? Because both of you have mentioned Russia. By and large, that involves, you can say there's an implication there. When you speak of Russia, you mean the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, which are not just Russia, but involve a whole vast landmass, which roughly corresponds to a sixth of the world's surface, which also roughly corresponds to the pivot area, if you take in the influence concession from the Russo-Anglo-Persian Agreement of 1907. But you mentioned it being a English outlook. And this is where I'm going to turn that argument in its head here, because you're correct. But it's English in the sense that the enemy isn't Russia. The enemy is Europe. The enemy is Germany. And if you read into Mackinder extensively, his hatred of Germany and his historical revisionism could make Winston Churchill blush in terms of trying to understand that position. So when you look at things like you mentioned Prometheism, that really, you can say, is a derivative of Mackinder. It doesn't come from Mackinder himself, in the same way that Panteranism, which is something else that you and I have discussed at length, Oliver, is something that was contemporaneous with Mackinder, but nevertheless, it does not inform Mackinder in the way that, say, for example, Pilsudski meant Prometheism. And you talk about Speakman, and we talk about containment doctrine. And again, you can say that is the American inheritance of Mackinder. And you can really say that Speakman is interesting in the sense that as an antecedent of Kissinger, we're now making it more Russocentric rather than European-centric, and that is with the mind to containing not just the geostrategic threat of Russia, but also containing the expansion of communism, which by the time that we have the rise of communism, Mackinder, you can say, has fallen from the limelight. When he's speaking in 1918, 1919, when he's speaking of democratic ideals, he's speaking of the ideological and strategic fraternity that binds the countries of France, Britain, and America together in terms that you would find easily recognizable to anyone who talks about the collective West and democracy versus the quote-unquote Oriental despotisms of Austria-Hungary, of Prussia, the Prussian monarchy, and of course of Russia. All of this is deeply embedded in the work of Mackinder. And indeed, you mentioned Alfred Thayer Mahan, who was an American naval officer, admiral, who wrote his famous on the influence of sea power, with specific reference to the British and the American empires in the 17th and the 18th century. Yes, it had a huge amount of influence on British and American thinkers, in particular due to the overriding sort of concern towards maintaining the blockade on Germany during World War I, the naval blockade. But also it was incredibly influential to the German Kaiser. So much so you can say that Mahan actually had more of an effect on the zeitgeist in Germany in the 1890s and 1900 than that perhaps did beyond, you can say, the more strategic thinking circles in Britain and the United States. And that one makes it fascinating, and I'll talk about the specificity of looking at Germany and Europe as the enemy rather than Russia in Mackinder's thinking. Because just to explain what the Heartland theory is in very brief terms, because we haven't gone over the specifics, what Mackinder is referring to is the end of what he refers to as the Columbian epoch, and this has many meanings which he wasn't aware of when he first used that terminology. But by the Columbian epoch, he roughly means that this is the end of the era of exploration that begins with Columbus in 1492. We found Australia, we found the Arctic, we've now found the Antarctic. There is no landmass for which to lay claim to. In other words, the world has evolved from an open system where there are still new territories and lands to conquer, to a closed system with definite understanding of political geography. And this is where it comes to this idea of the pivot. Within this worldview, naval powers have always had the dominance because they've been able to take advantage of these areas on the periphery, whether it be directly with someone like Australia or indirectly with someone like South America, and Britain maintaining effectively the American-inspired Monroe Doctrine. And here it comes to the idea of the pivot. When we have geographic certainties, when we understand that there is no new vast landmass out there that, say, for example, can create a new version of the Spanish Empire in the 20th century, then we look at the potentialities of Russia in particular. We look at the potentialities of the Eurasian landmass. We look at it as the world island, and that being incontrovertibly the largest stretch of land in terms of the amount of influence that one can wield through controlling it. And then it comes this idea that with that assumption, with that basic assumption of the relative strengths and population centers of these various landmasses, then it comes this idea of the pivot. We've had the dominance of sea power in the Columbian epoch, but with the certainties of a closed world system, we can now understand the potentialities of somewhere like Russia. And in this case, the pivot area, the heartland, becomes the ultimate citadel of land power. And for Mackinder, you take the heartland, you combine it with manpower, which is another major innovation of the 19th and 20th centuries. Manpower, as it so happens, is coined by Mackinder. Then we add to that logistics, which the reason I brought up the idea of the Soviet Project 903 that you brought to my attention, Morgoth, is the idea again that all of these vast land masses can be traversed in a way and made navigable in a way that was seemingly impossible, especially if we look at the old river arteries of Siberia, which were closed off for most of the year. And then you add in something which is not necessarily congruent with focusing specifically on Russian supremacy of the control of this particular area, but on adding to this naval supremacy. It's an old Napoleonic argument, and again, it should be mentioned that the sequel to Mahan's work was the influence on sea power and the French Revolution between 1795 and 1812. This idea that if there is no major land power from which to thwart that which basically indirectly or directly controls the heartland, his idea was Germany, then there will be unlimited time for them to pool those resources together and build a fleet that can threaten the quote-unquote democratic nations of the West vis-a-vis the Oriental despotisms. And what he clearly has in mind is the German high seas fleet. So you mentioned, Morgoth, this idea of this aesthetic of being focused, solely on the land. But you can say that so much of Mackinder's argument is actually predicated on long-termism, i.e., it doesn't matter if you have temporary naval supremacy. If you have the heartland, if you have manpower, and if you have logistics, then naval supremacy will naturally emanate out of that. And he goes into various historical examples. He looks at the rise of Macedon. He looks at the rise of this quote-unquote barbarian land power from the north during the time of Philip, later Alexander the Great, how it was able to take on the Peloponnesian League led by Sparta, subdue Athens, even though his history is sometimes often confused, I would say. And then he's able to take the island city of Tyre from the Phoenicians, which basically ensured again that sea power was overcome by superior land power. And he also comes and makes very early, and I would say very dubious examples with regards to Hellas and Mycenae versus Crete and the insular sea peoples and things like that. Again, you have to understand that when we're talking about his historical initiatives, we're looking at this as someone who has all the information available to someone in the early 20th century, not necessarily with the benefit of hindsight with regards to everything we understand about the Bronze Age collapse, etc., etc., etc. So we have this quintessential argument that it's about Russia, it's about Ukraine. But like I said, if you employ the British thinking, the explicit British thinking, the sort of thinking that got us involved in the First World War in the first place, and then you combine this to the fears, the anxieties around the German high seas fleet, the Tirpitz plan, the idea of pooling all of these naval resources in one area around Wilhelmshaven to Hamburg, then all of a sudden you can understand why the British were invested, say, for example, in ensuring that there was no situation whereby Russia and Germany could ever be united. And this is why I think is, I would say, the ultimate legacy and the true reason why understanding Mackinder is so important, because more fundamental than just simply controlling the heartland or allying with the heartland basically ensures that we look at the Anglo-American alliance, and this is something building off what you also said, Semyagog, about it becoming essentially American thinking. Well, like I said, the Americans were more than willing to receive this message. And in that sense, the end of the Columbian epoch becomes a threat directed against the post-Columbian nations within the Americas, explicitly America, i.e. it is incumbent on us to defend this Columbian epoch away from the Eurasian pivot back towards somewhere like Russia, and domination being predicated on the preponderance of this empire emerging out of the pivot area in particular. And if you understand that, then American and British foreign policy becomes focused on detaching Europe or Germany from Russia or the Soviet Union, in the same way that Mackinder was also obsessed with the potentialities of China, because a Russian-China alliance would allow for the Asia pivot and the heartland being connected to a major ocean outlet. And you mentioned, Morgoth, the idea of the Belt and Road Initiative. In that sense, again, Mackinder was ahead of his time in understanding the potentialities for China when he was writing this. This is geographic determinism, basically, because politically, when he was writing this, China was a basket case and controlled by European powers. But nevertheless, 120 years after writing this, we can actually see there is some validity in Mackinder's thinking in terms of the perils of associating the pivot area, the heartland, being allied to states on the periphery, or what Speakman would refer to as the rimland, whereby you can gain access to the sea and potentially threaten the Columbian epoch, i.e. the Anglo-American alliance. So just some thoughts, because like I said, it's seldom presented to me in that light. But I think if you begin to look at it in terms of the fears of alliance, so much as the fears of a monotonous empire as a monolith, it becomes all that more interesting to consider.
So, Miguel, you got anything? Well,
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, considering the mid-century Germans, if you just throw that into the basic mix, where then you have the strange scenario from Mackinder's analysis, because if it's meant to contain Germany, but then we see that with the mid-century Germans, you get this truly revolutionary position where the mid-century Germans actually invade the heartland and try to conquer it. And you can see that would have been a sort of all-hands-on-deck nightmare scenario from the Anglo alliance, because then you've got them on their doorstep, but it's kind of like inverting how you would see the heartland theory, where a country on the periphery, on the rim, actually invades the heartland, which isn't a sea power, it isn't an Anglo, and tries to go for broke and sort of take all the chips on the table. A risky proposition, but if they had pulled it off, it would have spent. I can understand why, beyond the usual reasons, it was just truly a nightmare scenario for the Anglo alliance, the sea powers.
Well, as you can see on this map, this is actually a map I used for another stream, which was focusing on the forgotten Germans, the Eastern Germans, which were ethnically cleansed following World War II for this exact reason. But Mackinder focuses a lot on, you can say, rivers and the potential demarcation points of European geography. One such demarcation point, he believes, is the Volga River. And of course, as you can see on this map, we have a vast enclave of Russian-based Germans around Saratov and what was then called Engels and the Volga River, the Volga Germans. And for Mackinder, and this is actually why, like I said, in a bizarre way, he has been politically outmoded for this, because it basically, he was thinking about the enemy using this. He was thinking about this from the point of view of someone who saw Germany as the overarching enemy. But nevertheless, the Germans thought, actually, no, he's given us an idea. He's basically projected this idea onto us, which didn't really occur to us. But now, yes, it seems like it has some weight to it, which is the Lebensraum idea, the idea of collecting all of these German populations in the Eastern settling and coming to dominate effectively the heartland. And this is why, again, I believe there is some validity in looking at this point of view, because it's flexible. It's flexible in regards to what power basically considers to be the ultimate threat, whether it be China, whether it be Germany / Europe, or whether it be the Soviet Union / Russia. There are several scenarios one can draw here. One, which you mentioned, Morgov, is the idea of quote unquote Germany going for broke and using the precedent of the Ostsiedlung, the Eastern settling, to take over the heartland by this, you can say, call basically to racial, not just to sort of geographic determinism, which is inherent in someone like Haushofer. But then you come to the other idea, which is the terror Bjorko, the idea of the Kaiser and Nicholas II meeting with their private yachts and deciding that, we are going to tear up the alliances as previously understood, and we are going to reforge an alliance between Germany and the Russian Empire. And under that logic, essentially, again, you have the issue. If Germany doesn't have to deal with the threat of the heartland and all the logistical and manpower capabilities of the heartland, then it is basically free to pursue its naval policy against Great Britain, which is why you could say there was such a determined fear in World War I and in many subsequent conflicts, whether it be pitting Napoleon against the Russians, pitting the Kaiser against the Russians, or pitting Hitler against the Soviet Union. The same logic creeps into all of this. And now, of course, pitting the European Union against Russia. So long as there is this constant unwavering animus between the European powers, however they're constituted, and Russia, the heartland, it basically ensures that America and Britain and the quote-unquote democratic alliance states, in this case he was thinking of France, can achieve a modicum of security. But Semigog, you wanted to say something?
I was just going to throw in that there's another way to look at it in terms of what is not said in terms of the stunning silence in the entire theoretical framework. Would you mind going back to the map that just shows the sort of whole picture of the world? So when you look at this, the United States, the New World, North and South America are pushed to the periphery of necessity, because in order to show the pivot area most effectively as a pivot, it should take the center of the map. And so you see the way in which the New World is just sort of, relegated to this marginal existence, when in fact, if you look at a British, I call it British, I'm sorry, most of it's English, but when you look at English strategic thinking and the way in which the British islands have been they've been a fortress protected by a great moat across its history, you can see how there was a projection of the United States to being such a thing. It's thought of as its own sort of unsinkable island fortress. North America itself, with its an even larger moat than Britain had. And of course, you see this with some of the strategic thinking of a figure like Mahan. I mentioned earlier that the way in which we are enjoined to focus on this area is a way in which strategic thinking, coming down now through across more than a century, it's a way in which we've been the nature of the argument and the terms that are presented constrains us to thinking about it in a particular way, when you could easily see the entire landmass of the Americas as its own pivot area. But by keeping us focused on Russia, we maintain English or British interests and strategies, instead of looking at the way in which the New World could be its own kind of pivot area. It's just assumed, it's taken as a given since the end of the Civil War in the United States, in which
the funny thing is, I don't agree with you, and the reason I don't agree with you is because as Mackinder himself developed his theories, he was basically content to place Britain within this complex as nothing more than an American maritime aerodrome. He wrote that in 1943. There is much assumption within British political thinking, essentially, that deference is basically given over to American strategic interests and how Britain can best be served within that whole complex. And the reason I brought up his reference of the Columbian epoch, as I mentioned, he's talking about one thing, which is the creation of a definite geographic world system. But like I said, on the other, it's a threat. It's a threat to the Columbian world system, the idea that we have the geographic pivot towards these certainties. And he believes that in view of his geographic determinism, which is not a view I hold, therefore Russia must be the greatest threat, because even if America can dominate the entirety of the Americas, that being all the way from Canada and Baffin Island all the way down to Patagonia and Argentina, by the whole nature of the Eurasian landmass, there are more people, more resources, and more territory within this area. And so ultimately, yes, you can say that looking at this through the point of view of British interests means that the focus becomes the Eurasian landmass rather than American isolationism. But nevertheless, from his point of view, ultimately, he who controls the Eurasian landmass will ultimately become the world's greatest power. America may exist within that whole nexus as a power, but ultimately, from his point of view, it becomes in America's interests to keep tabs on the pivot area by using Britain, as he says, as this maritime aerodrome, so to speak. So in his view, and in the views of what he considers to be the democratic ideals of enlightened civilization versus the Oriental despotisms, we need to share in this policy. And another thing he mentions, regards to Maham, and juxtaposing this with land power, the viability of land power, he is very much concerned with the vulnerabilities of maritime hegemony. He was directing his arguments against the Germans. He believed that the German U-boat campaign and the German high seas fleet basically invalidated the arguments of Mahan, because no longer were sea routes this source basically of stability and imperial and commercial stability that they were assumed to be, because of the whole fractured nature and, of course, the emergence of competing naval powers and the dominance and stability of the land power, as I mentioned. But he doesn't draw any attention to the fact that American naval dominance ultimately overcomes British naval dominance within World War II. And you can apply basically that same argument. The obsessive focus, like I said, is on Europe. It's on Russia. And like I said, to again push back against this idea of the obsession with British interests, it's against China. And one of the reasons I was so interested in bringing up Mackinder again, as we're looking at this, you can say I would say very amateurish attempt of the American State Department to pivot towards Asia. That seems to be America's own assumption of its own interests lie in protecting Taiwan and in basically trying to break up the Chinese-Russian alliance. Well, Mackinder was prophesizing these sort of things 120 years ago. So like I said, you can look at it as, oh, he's basically, pursuing explicitly English objectives. Yes, they may have been at the time, especially if you look at the huge amount of historical animus he has towards Germany. I mean, I'm thinking about reading out a particular passage, but like I said, ultimately, it is influential and it is relevant because it coincides with not only American theoretical interests, but explicit stated policy.
I would just say that all you've done, as far as I can tell, is make the argument that the New World, the United States, certainly North America, is like a new and better Britain in terms of the rest of the world, as a kind of isomorphic analogy of Britain itself relative to the continent across its history. And so we see a situation where the United States is simply a better place to undertake the British project from, with greater resources and greater access to the seas, and today with a larger fleet performing the same function. And I would also say that you're leaving out the historical warm relations between the U.S., relatively warm, between the U.S. and Russia, that only really began to shift after the victory of the New Englanders, the ones with the strong focus on having come from southern England in the U.S. North. And of course, immediately following that, you had the rise of people like Roosevelt, who was a good friend, as you know, of Mahan's. And you had the appearance of the Great White Fleet, which you know all about, how it was deployed in order to take care of British interests in the Pacific. And as you well know better than I do, that there was a period where there was a lot of discussion about whether or not the United States with a Pacific fleet should be used in this respect as a policeman, or whether or not all their money should have been placed on the little square for Japan. And of course, the U.S. fleets doing things like getting involved in the Pacific Rim, that was initially supported by the British wholeheartedly. And of course, Roosevelt wrote an article in the Atlantic, extolling the brilliance of Mahan's work, which really to me just seemed like making an argument to the entire United States that they need to fork out the money for a navy in order to take care of what are ostensibly American interests, but in the end ended up serving British interests.
You see, the problem. I don't want to push back too much against this, but I think this is almost in some ways tangential to this discussion. And the reason I say that is because you can say the exact same thing in reverse. So, for example, I bring up Mahan and I bring up Mackinder specifically because he raises this precise point, which is the idea that American domination over the Philippines and American domination over Cuba during the American-Spanish War of 1898 was only made possible because the British basically compelled the Spanish navies to stand down. And again, that's a point I've actually made on other streams, the whole notion that it was contrary to British interests to unequivocally support America's position within the Caribbean and basically inveigling on British maritime interests within the Pacific region. But as you know, Roosevelt was president in 1901, and this was during William McKinley. So this was 7 years before, where the Americans were basically being enabled to have an empire in the Pacific as a result of the direct acquiescence of the British fleet. In particular, one instance over the fall of Manila, where the British decisively intervened on the side of the Americans without a shot being fired. And that, again, is an instance of quote unquote great sea power. So you can say it's English, all English, but like I said, I think it works both ways. And what this is bleeding off, essentially, is Rudyard Kipling and The Great Game, and focusing essentially on all of the areas in which the British Empire becomes vulnerable. You can say that the American Empire either succeeded the British or it became something else or whatever. But the point of view is, yes, there is a degree of continuity within the political calculus. And a lot of Mackinder's thinking is inherited by people like Spikeman. And if you look at this map in particular, which is the successor map, it doesn't talk about the pivot area, instead talks about the rimland. This essentially is the area over which Russia cannot be allowed to gain strategic influence, because as you can tell, it is an area with which Russia can use to project power outwards towards the sea. And in that sense, it is a very quintessential Crimean War argument. You know, we can't allow Russia to have an outlet into the Mediterranean Ocean. Russia can't be allowed to hold on to Constantinople, which is ironic considering that this map actually allocates the Black Sea as part of the Heartland, almost assuming that it's guaranteed that if you control the Black Sea, then of course you will be able to operate within this grander strategic political theater of the Indian Ocean, of the Pacific, of the Atlantic, etc. So, you know, we can argue essentially who mainly benefits from this, but it's incontrovertible to say that both American and British thinkers have looked at this, and they've taken all of the applications of this, whether it be Prometheism and focusing on containment, anti-communism, or the breakup with Russia specifically because of this, or in trying to detach the major European power, whether it be Napoleon or whether it be Germany, from any alliance with Russia or the Soviet Union for the sake, again, of maintaining Britain's uncontested sea power. And a very tenuous example he comes is going back to this idea of the fall of Crete and the fall of Phoenicia. And you could even say a more contemporary example would actually be the fall of the Netherlands. The idea that Dutch naval power basically became a nonsense when Prussia could easily and without much effort occupy the country within a few days. And this was, you know, going all the way back to the 18th century. All these important things to consider. But Morgoth, you've been very quiet. Anything you would like to say?
Yeah, just on the note on containing communism there over in the Far East, because one of the conflict that we don't talk about very much, and it seems to get forgotten these days, is the Vietnam War. And you can see again that rhetoric of containment was the idea that if Vietnam falls, if all of Vietnam falls, that Asia's going to go down one domino after another. But ultimately, you can see that it's as if they would frame it as if communism was going to take over. But of course, what they really meant, like we're talking about Heartland theory again, just this time through an ideological lens. But ultimately, it would have meant that they would have reached, it would have broke out. It would have broke through the Rimland containment zone. And it kind of explains what many people now would regard as being like a totally confusing and pointless conflict with, I think, what was it, 60,000 Americans died or something, and the amount of resources that were poured into it, which is people just look at it today as if like totally bizarre. But when you look at this, you begin to think, yeah, it was really about containing. Again, it's always about the containment.
And we see that with Iran today. You know, the policies that have driven Russia into the arms of China to whatever extent, and the policy of tightening the relationships between Russia and China and Iran. You now see a situation where the Heartland, at least in terms of trade and logistical corridors, and of course it's divided between, you know, 3 or more countries in terms of some of the stuff with Central Asia, of course, but you've got the Heartland here now reaching down through Iran to the Persian Gulf and to the Indian Ocean. and you've got the Heartland extended out to all of the Chinese coast now. So you see an interesting situation where, the rimland here has been penetrated in two places, or is on the cusp of being penetrated in that way. The north-south corridor is basically just a cut through the rimland there down to the Persian Gulf, and that explains, of course, why we've got so much attention on the Emirates to have our own sort of choke point there. Choke points, of course, being central to Mackinder's thinking, but we've also got a way in which the rimland has been cut, as I said, with Russia and China being connected more thoroughly now.
I think this is fascinating because we hear a lot of rhetoric in the news in Britain in particular, maybe even more than what you see in America now with Trump in promising no more wars. But at any rate, London is spreading war propaganda. They're making the wheels are turning to get people prepared for war. We're getting bombarded with quite a bit of this. Leaving aside the state of the country and like that's a whole other thing, but like why people probably won't go to fight, that's a whole other subject. But you kind of get the impression that everybody's kind of confused and thinking, well, where are we going to Ukraine? Are we going to Iran? Like what? But I think it's possible that there's people somewhere in London, in some dusty office in Whitehall or whatever, and they are looking at a map like this. And they're like saying what Semyagog's just saying. Like basically, we've now got two breaches in the containment zone, and there's we've got China, which is now and then we've also potentially got Iran breaching as well. And this is and because of the received wisdom, because it's just ingrained that, well, this means conflict because we can't possibly allow this to happen. And so you begin to see that the wheels turning as if to prepare people for war, prepare people for battle. And again, you get the idea that there's somebody looking at a map like this, looking like saying what Semyagog's just said, like it's the rimland's hemorrhaging, the containment's being broken in 2 or 3 different places.
And the large question is, why did we do that? Because everyone knows, everyone who's studied geopolitics and global strategy, the great game, they know that you're not supposed to drive China and Russia together. You're supposed to try to keep them apart. That's the whole thing with Nixon's opening. And we know that Iran was a country that was pretty cut off. It had decent relationships with China, but we were in Afghanistan and it blocked the possibilities there. And Russia was hesitant to get involved with Iran because it hoped for some kind of opening of relations or improvement of relations with the West. And yet we drove all 3 of these elements together. The United States, under the Biden administration and possibly earlier, chose to do this. I think it's absolutely impossible to imagine that they did not know what would occur. So that raises the question for me. I mean, we're simultaneously destroying Europe, and under the Biden administration, we clearly intended. There's just no way to imagine that what has happened, what has resulted, was not foreseen and intended.
You kind of get the impression that the Heartland is this sort of amorphous kind of blob where if you push too hard in one direction, the pressure will end up like shoving it off into the other direction. So if you push too hard over the Ukraine issue, you push too hard there, you alienate Russia there, it'll just run towards China. And you get the impression it could go the other way as well. So if you shove too hard in one direction, so if China suddenly turned on Russia, like you would expect the Russians to be very peaceable towards the east. And it is this kind of jello where you just push it one direction, it'll bulge out in another.
Can I quickly reference this map? Because for people who don't know, this is you can say not necessarily historically continuous map over all the territories that were nominally part of the Mongol Empire at one point. So the map on the left, it may look impressive, but ultimately, even by this time, the map had begun to essentially break down, and you have the fragmentation of the Mongol Empire into the Ilkhanate, the Golden Horde, the Chagatai Khanate, and the Yuan dynasty. But nevertheless, when Mackinder is writing about the geographical pivot, he has this in mind. Except for him, the reality which he sees emerging in the 20th century is actually much worse than this. As you can see, the Mongol Empire has an outlet into China, into Korea, into North Vietnam. There's actually a weird episode where, in addition to trying to invade Japan, Kublai Khan actually also tries to invade Java at one point, but that's neither here nor there. But you also see, of course, the control of the Strait of Hormuz through Iran, expanding into Turkey and expanding up to the Danube, modern-day Romania, and in Russia. But for that empire basically to survive, you need to understand the map on the right, which is a very loose understanding basically of where the population centers were within the Mongol Empire at that time. And that essentially is why Mackinder is so terrified, because as you pointed out, Morgoth, it seems that the Mongol Empire especially, it had to pivot to one region at the expense of all the others. So the Mongol Empire decided to focus all of its attention under Kublai Khan into controlling China, but that basically meant it lost control over Russia, and it lost control over Iran. Instead, those were held by other dynasties, which overall would fragment, as all of the Mongol states would later fragment. But to speak of basically a heartland in the 13th and 14th centuries, when basically this map, you could say the nightmare of Mackinder is realized, is rather absurd, because the only thing keeping all of these population centers together is superior Mongol logistics, because there are no great population centers in what Mackinder basically referred to as the pivot area. So when we're coming into the 20th century, when we're talking about this definite understanding of geographical realities, which Mackinder claims, and that sort of informs so much of his geographic determinism, we have this empty space in the middle, which once was connected by the superior logistics of the Mongol armies, is now being filled in by major population centers in southern Siberia and eastern Russia, and those are expanding. And of course, population centers in Central Asia. Interestingly enough, this map at the time isn't so distinct from the relative sort of population balance that we have in Central Asia at this time. But if you essentially have this map, this green map, and it's all filled in, that is basically the understanding of Mackinder's thinking. Instead of the Mongolian horse armies, or the cavalry armies, you now have the Trans-Siberian Railway connecting all of these places. Indeed, it sort of has two natural outlets, which goes back to my Russia's greatest defeat video, where I was talking about the natural extension of Russia to the Carpathian Mountains in the west, but also into the wild fields of Manchuria. And interestingly enough, Mackinder makes this exact same argument, that the natural extension of Russia would be into Manchuria, would be towards Korea, would be towards China. And so therefore it informs so much of British political thinking in terms of propping up their ally Japan in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905 to deny Russia access to all of these territories. So this geopolitical reality that you see with the Mongol Empire is basically, as far as Mackinder's being concerned, it is being re-established centuries later. However, unlike what existed at the time of the Mongol Empire, what didn't exist in the 13th and 14th centuries was this Anglophone concern, this idea that the Columbian world and the strategic fortress island of Britain is basically now being placed in a position of existential threat, thanks to the establishment of this empire. And so a theory, the Heartland theory, becomes essentially a necessity in order to understand this and potentially thwart it. And as a result of this, you come back to ideas of containment, etc. So yes, there's also another point, which is, do either of you have anything to say regarding, I'm not sure again how much either of you read Mackinder, but taking the Mongol example, taking the Turkic example, but to add to this, he also looks at the vulnerability of places like Iraq, of Suez, of Egypt, of Syria, vis-a-vis the Arabs. And I was thinking this is basically a forerunner to American policy vis-a-vis Egypt and Arab nationalism, British policy as well, and of course towards Israel today.
No, I don't have anything to say to that.
I do, and it's not from a it's not from the it's not from any perspective of certainty. It's from the perspective of some gaps in Mackinder's and Speakman's thinking, and that has to do with the role of Africa. Figures like Mackinder talk about the importance of North Africa, as a position from which trouble could be caused with Suez, and havoc could be wrought, so to speak, in the Mediterranean area and with shipping and trade there. And of course, Suez as a major choke point. You also have the idea of the Dardanelles, a choke point of lesser importance these days, but still an important one. So on the one hand, you look at this entire picture of the Heartland as a center of population. With the Rimland as a center of population, but the Heartland is this pivot. But when you look at it from the perspective of a world island, then and indeed it's presented in that way by Mackinder and others. The main world island is Europe, Asia, and Africa, and it includes a rimland, but it's the rimland of the world island. And of course, most of these projections don't show very well the actual size of Africa. Particularly the Mercator projections that we grew up with in the United States tend to minimize it, just how massive it is. So the Middle East to me is interesting, of course, because it has all the choke points. You call it the Middle East if you're from the old thinking. You call it West Asia if you're, a Mercurius type figure who likes to talk about the global South, and West Asia to signal that it should be connected to China and Russia more than it should be connected to the Western powers. There's all of that. There's all of the importance of energy, and I generally like to think of Israel as a kind of IUD. Back in the days when women would have some strange wiry plastic thing inserted into their uterus, based on the belief that the presence of that foreign object there would prevent the appearance of a fertilized embryo that would grow into a child. I think, as we all know, Israel was placed there in some respect to be an IUD to prevent Arabs from getting their shit together and cooperating. And they have enough trouble doing that even without the presence of Israel. So there's all of that. But I also think of it, and this is a long way of saying it, I also think of it as a way to cut off one half of the world island from the other. And of course, it's a very resource-rich and underdeveloped region, Africa.
Sorry, just for clarity, are you talking about the Suez Canal or Israel?
Well, I'm talking about that whole region of the Middle East, which I understood you to be asking about, and the way in which keeping that area unstable makes it not impossible, but unlikely that you're going to fully develop the logistical corridors and trade through that region, permitting, African resources to flow to the other half of the world island. So I guess what I'm saying there, and not doing a very good job of it, is that in addition to the energy and choke point concerns, I believe that region is of strategic importance because it is a way of dividing the world island into two sections. And when you take a look at someone like Haushofer, with whom you'll certainly be familiar, you'll know that he had these ideas of north-south combinations, which still strategically inform thinking, it would seem, because the EU has pursued this policy of connection with Africa as a source of resources. So if you cut the heartland off from Africa via instability in the Middle East, then you're in a better position to do a north-south combination, what Haushofer would have called Eurafrica. And we see, all you have to do is visit all these European countries, and you will see the implementation of this Eurafrica policy. And likewise, I would say that as payback for trouble in Ukraine and Macron's constant posturing about how he's going to send French troops in, and the likelihood that they're already there operating sub rosa, Russia went in and just hammered the shit out of France in the last couple of years in terms of creating major problems for them in the Sahel. So hopefully that didn't come out in such a disjointed fashion, and you guys can follow the basic outlines.
Well, no, I mean, in fairness to Mackinder, but he was sort of writing this in 1904 through to 1919, during which Africa was part of the European empires. So we're still thinking basically in an imperial mode before we get to a destabilizing mode, you can say, from the 1940s onwards, when you have the post-imperial period, when you have countries like Syria gaining independence. You have the instability in Iran with the Mossadegh, the coup against Mossadegh in favor of the Shah and things like that. The creation of the State of Israel in 1948. This is all after Mackinder's death, essentially. So the political calculus changes, and indeed you can say that the strategy changes effectively because, as I mentioned, so much of the thinking around what would later become the Great Game and the focus on the pivot area and all this geographical determinism is again based on the idea that Britain and essentially later America via proxies and influence is going to be in control, or the predominating influence within the Rimland and by extension into Africa. Add in decolonization, the whole sort of basis of this changes. But then in fairness to Mackinder looks at the historic potentialities of something like the Arabian Peninsula and believes that a reunification a la Muhammad during the height of the 7th century, which would later lead to the Islamic conquest, etc., could be repeated given his whole view of geographic determinism. Ironically, he puts too much stock on someone like Lawrence of Arabia in terms of being able to achieve that. But again, to your point, Semigog, what actually happens is that the policy of Arab nationalism is screwed over. We have the Sykes-Picot Agreement, we have the division of Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Palestine, and what later be the State of Israel. And ultimately, as we see with the failed project of, say, for example, Nasserism or Baathism, which is basically being killed off now that Assad has also been deposed. This policy, which essentially was enacted all the way back in 1916, is very much continuing in this mode. And again, it is in part a response to what Mackinder believes would be the geographically determined outcome of uniting a certain territory in the Arab Peninsula and allowing for it to be dominated, to assume dominance over the Semitic and Levantine territories, but also the extension of that being the Heartland theory from the north. He looks at the examples of the Turks and the Abbasid Caliphates and later the Seljuks, etc., and the Ottomans coming in and dominating from the north. So from the view of 19th century British thinkers, English thinkers, to be more specific, the view of Arab nationalism from the south and the Soviet Union combined to an ally or satellite in Iran from the north, which again looked as if that could potentially come into existence during the Second World War as well, when the Soviets annexed territories like larger, greater Azerbaijan, and looked at one point as if they were going to be turning those into Soviet states.
And a very quick question. 1904, when he's writing, isn't that roughly in the period where Rhodes is talking about Cape Town to Cairo railroads? Do you happen to have a very brief answer for why that all got shut down so thoroughly?
It didn't get shut down so thoroughly. I mean, he talks about this interestingly, as if it would have been the natural outcome, that when we speak about Africa, we have to speak of South Africa effectively as an island, due to the impassability of that territory up until, for example, basic inoculations were essentially permitted European travelers to get into Central Africa for the first time, missionaries, etc., in the 19th century. Otherwise, he believes that, again, looking at this point of view of like a geographic determinist, that all it would take is this united Arab power to come through Egypt, go through Sudan, and reach as far as Cape Town, because apart from, like I said, the prevalence of the jungles and the diseases, there would seem to be nothing stopping it. Again, the domination of the Heartland through this combination of, or alliance between the Arab states and Russia. As for the whole sort of unity of Cecil Rhodes's project, I mean, like I said, we're talking about like an imperial paradigm in 1904. 1904 is just after the Second Boer War, and it'll be 6 years when we have the consolidation of South Africa into the Union of South Africa. So that project, the Milner Kindergarten, etc., of uniting all these territories, of creating, a Belgian possession over Rwanda and Burundi, and later a League of Nations mandate in Tanzania. After World War II, these territories were actually connected, but like I said, they could come against the American view, which is that of decolonization, and of course the destructive effects of our involvement in both World War Wars that lead us effectively bankrupt. And so decolonization becomes essentially the route following the Winds of Change speech in 1960. Like I said, when we talk about Mackinder, he has odes to various things, but he's also speaking within somewhat of the mindset of, like I said, a contemporary of Cecil Rhodes.
Roger that. Sorry to interrupt you, Morgoth.
I was just going to point out, I remember you did a stream a while ago about the impossibility of peace in Ukraine. And then when I look at Iran on the map here and its situation at the south of the Caspian Sea, and you can just look to the north and you can see that you run into Russia immediately. And then recently we've had the talk about, as soon as the Israel and Iran went on the 12-day war, as Trump called it, there was talk about regime change. There was talk about installing a Shah. And I was thinking, if Iran gets knocked out here, if there's an overthrow, and if they actually do this, are then Russia and China going to tolerate having what would amount to an American client state in that position just south of the Caspian Sea? Or would we not just be doing the Ukraine thing all over again, where nobody's happy and everybody sees it as an existential threat? Because you can imagine, like you can just look at it just in terms of geography, not even to mention the supply lines and all of the gas pipes and the energy reserves and all of the rest of it. To actually, if you succeeded in having Iran as a client state, like what does that mean for Russia under Putin, but then more largely in terms of the Rimland and containment? Because it seems to me they just couldn't allow that to happen, that you would be faced with another Ukraine situation.
There are two things to address. I'm going to sort of bring up Ukraine later on because it's a very important point. But the main thing that separates Ukraine from Iran is that Ukrainian nationality is a modern thing. It doesn't really come into existence until the late 19th century. As much as people want to claim that, Ukraine is the original Russia, and you go back to the Kievan Rus and, Vladimir the Great, etc., as an intellectual movement and a proposition, it comes to the fore within the Austrian Empire, and then it becomes a statelet in the 1920s, effectively. Whereas Iran is a civilization state that's existed for over 2,000 years. So what Ukraine is basically having to grapple with is a crisis of identity, because it's never basically had to form one in such absolute opposition, say, for example, to Russia, given the fact that there are so many Russian speakers and the whole territory of Ukraine isn't conducive for a distinct anti-Russian national identity, which is what I was trying to get across. But so that, I believe, is fundamental in terms of understanding the distinction between Iran and Ukraine, even though both are heterogeneous states effectively. Iran doesn't have a long history as being part of the Russian Empire. But onto the question of Iran, that is basically the situation that existed pre-1979. I mean, the Shah, following 1953 up until 1979, Americans and British had extraterritoriality. BP was effectively a foreign-owned concern. So much of the focus of the revolution, again, was this notion, essentially, of the assertion of Iranian sovereignty. vis-a-vis America. And you can almost say that that is actually not continuous with the historical norm. I mean, so much of the historical norm of the last 150 years, Morgoth, has actually been of a implicit power sharing agreement between the British, later the Americans, and the Russians. Basically, the Russians have a controlling influence over the northern part of Iran, the Mazandaran, the areas of the South Caspian, and over the Azeri-dominated populations around the city of Tabriz. And the British and the Americans have control over the areas around nearing Baluchistan, i.e. the borders of the Indian Empire, now Pakistan, and of course the Khuzestan region, the Zagros Mountains, the area where there is the preponderance of Iranian oil, for example. What happened is in the 1940s and 50s, the Soviet Union overextended itself on many different fronts. We already know about the Berlin blockade. We know about the Iron Curtain. We know about the formalization of the Warsaw Pact. What we know less of is the fact that Turkey, for example, had historically positive relations with the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union pressed too far and Turkey ended up becoming a part of NATO. In the same way in Iran, Stalin tried to annex large regions of northern Iran to the Soviet Union in the Azeri-dominated populations, what was seen to be key zones of Russian interests. And all that did was drive the Iranians further into the arms of the British and Americans. So that situation, like I said, it basically existed between 1953 and 1979. As for the potential of that happening again, I've seen the thing brought up that if this happens, it'll be an existential issue for China. It'll be an existential issue for Russia, not just from the point of view of an outlet into the Persian Gulf and into the Indian Ocean, but from the point of view of China and Russia being, reliant on Iranian resources, etc. I don't see that happening. Personally, I believe that what the effect of the 12 days quote unquote war has basically been has to consolidate the Iranian regime, not the opposite. And I also think that Russia has more interest basically in being invested in Iran as a vassal. So it doesn't do something, say, for example, as acquiring nukes from North Korea and going rogue. So it's a very interesting question, like I said, but those are just some thoughts on the history and the policy regarding that region. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah.
So I think moving on to like the final area for this evening is something that Semigod brought up quite early on, which is this idea of Prometheism. We've had this idea of the Heartland not being able to break into the Rimland effectively, or the ulterior crescent, something which Mackinder would refer to. But now we have the idea of breaking up the Heartland itself, because so much of the anxiety, the strategic thinking, is predicated in the idea that the Heartland is basically engorged or formed an alliance with states surrounding it, the main states being China, Iran, or the European Union, assumed at the time to be under the domination of the Germans. And of course, that was the strategic thinking up until the defeat of Nazi Germany in World War II. But he draws reference specifically to Tyrannism. And interestingly, Mackinder is not an advocate for the breakup of the Russian Empire. In fact, if you read him, he is actually quite the Slavophile. He goes as far as basically to say that the cause of World War I was that of a Slav rebellion against the encroachments of the German-dominated Austro-Hungarian and Prussian alliance, effectively, which is historically ridiculous, but nevertheless, I think it's interesting to see that so much of the thinking of the time of Britain, of certain sort of Prussophobic, Germanophobic theorists, which will later go on basically to inform someone like Winston Churchill, is the fact that the ethnic makeup of Russia is an incidental feature. And this is where you can basically say that if there is some credence given to this idea of the notion of a heartland beyond the geographic certainties, is the idea that, at least to someone like Mackinder, and he's very much basing this off the ideas of a Finnish ethnologist, Matthias Castrum, that there are quote unquote Turkic speaking language groups as far as northern Siberia, all the way up until we get to northern Iran, the Azeris, and modern Turkmenistan. And that would effectively enable for an assertion of a heartland, quote unquote, formed by this geography due to the, you can say, continuities between these various language groups. What he doesn't do is something that you and I, Semyagog, have talked about extensively, is try and take these language groups and use it as the justification for nation building, something in opposition to a Slav-dominated heartland, which in this case would be the Russian Empire. He doesn't really deal with the Slav question at all. Like I said, he seems to be viewing the opposite. His attempt is essentially to Germanize the Slav-speaking areas of Eastern Europe and the Russian Empire to make it less German and effectively more Slav. You can say in many ways he's an advocate for Pan-Slavism, which would actually later run contrary to British interests, such as the fixation of Germany. But nevertheless, when we get to a figure like Pilsudski, as you mentioned, Semyagog, we have this idea of taking the heartland and pitting all these various nationalities against each other. Because, of course, on the one hand, we have Poland in the west, but we have Japan in the east. We've already mentioned the Russo-Japanese War. But again, it's this idea that both these powers on the extremes of both sides of the quote-unquote heartland can use nationalism as a means to break up the Slav preponderance of the Russian Federation. And Ukraine is a banner example of this. And the reason why I believe, if the Ukraine project works, why there's such an obsession behind the Ukraine project working is, with the possible exception of Belarus, Ukraine is the most Russified of all of the former Soviet republics. It doesn't have a distinct history of independence like the Baltic states, which were more aligned to Sweden, Denmark, and of course, the Baltic German nobility, nor indeed when we talk about like the Bukhara Emirates and the princely Muslim states in Central Asia, or the more sort of Chinese influenced areas in the East. Instead, if Ukraine is basically able to form an identity which is detached from Russia, then all of a sudden you can take the Tartars of Kazan, you can take the Kalmucks, and you can take the areas around the Kuban region. Even, there aren't many Circassians left, of course, Semyagog, but you can take all of these myriad ethnic groups, the Finno-Ugric populations around the Ural Mountains, and you can pit them against this conception of Russian unity. This isn't something, like I said, which is implicit to Mackinder, because this isn't Mackinder's focus of concern. But when we look beyond the policies of containment and we look further towards the dismantling of the heartland itself, consolidating the rimland effectively with organizations like NATO, like Iran formerly being an ally in 1979, NATO being a current member, Ukraine potentially joining NATO, Finland now being a member of NATO, Japan being an ally with the United States, and then you focus on the dismantling of the heartland itself. Basically, what do you... I just want to basically ask your thoughts on this.
Well, it ties in with what Morgoth was asking about earlier with the importance of Iran in various respects. Of course, Turkey, as a NATO power, has been heavily involved in pushing a kind of pan-Turanism. I mean, back in the old days of, Enver Bey, who wanted to disappear up into, I can't even remember, maybe he did disappear up into Central Asia trying to push pan-Turanism. He was
yes,
on the bottom.
Yes, he was shot.
Yeah.
He formed an alliance with the Emir of Bukhara and tried to launch a rebellion in Central Asia, but he was just killed off by the Red Army. Yeah,
they said, fuck that shit. Pardon my French. But so Turkey has long been involved, arguably, more recently with Western support in trying to get things going in that region. The Chinese, by contrast with their own problems with the Uyghur, have been trying to tamp that down. It's also not in Russia's interest. So you've got Russia saying, no, thank you. And you have China saying, no, thank you. And then you have Turkey as a NATO power trying to get up in there and involved with things. There was a guy I knew who went from Xinjiang, China, all the way to Turkey on the old Silk Road with camels. Back in that brief period in the in the second half of the 90s when such things were possible. And he visited some places that were basically cultural centers, NGO kind of organizations in Central Asia, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, where, what's his name? Oh, good God, what's his name? Gulen, Fethullah Gulen, and his people were heavily funding outreach of this kind. So there's been a push to get involved up in that area. But to bring it back around to what I said at the outset here, that this ties into Iran. Iran, as you very well know, AM, has long-standing relationships along the Silk Road routes and up through Central Asia. You know, in ancient times, you had the Sogdians speaking an Iranic language on the borders and within what is now Chinese territory. So if you have Iran, you have a tool to counterbalance pan-Turanism in the so-called stands of the Heartland. So that by way of a brief sort of set of remarks on the influence of Turkey and pan-Turanist ideas in that region, the importance of China in particular and Russia as well, being disinclined to let that go too far, and they wield considerable influences in places like Kazakhstan, which you're familiar with, which is probably one of the most important, or one of the most important ones in terms of its energy and its size. And then on the other hand, you have the fact that Iran is a gateway to that region. Both of you will probably remember that in the days of the Great Game, the classic Great Game of the 19th century, a lot of the British spies and agents and surveyors and the rest, they went into that region via Iran and supported by Iranian intelligence assets.
One of the things with Mackinder is that he views it that there's an ingrained sort of liberalism and progressivism to the sea-based powers. And there's at the same time, the heartland, the land-based powers are inherently more conservative and rooted to the land. And what I think is interesting when we bring in the idea of breaking up the heartland itself into all of the various different ethnicities and little statelets and everything, is when you look at Alexander Dugin's fourth political theory, whatever it's called. And he's basically, because it's interesting because he is kind of like an intellectual of the heartland and he despises Western liberalism. And I'm pretty sure that he'll have read Mackinder and imbibed all of that, but from like a totally different perspective. But in the fourth political theory, what isn't it called? He wants to have this. It's a kind of convoluted, I think. But basically, he wants to ensure that all of the different ethnicities in Russia, or in the heartland in this case, have their place. They feel secure. That they're not going to have, say, their demographics changed by immigration. They're not going to be moved around. They're not going to have their traditions undermined. They're not going to get the kind of drubbing that liberalism dishes out to Western nations. And in a sense, he frames that as being a sort of a counter to Western liberalism. But again, when you come back to Mackinder and you come back to Heartland theory, you can see that there's actually quite a pragmatic angle to that. I think he even wants to have some kind of Islamic Orthodox fusion religion, which everybody can be happy with in the region. And the thing is, the pragmatic side of it is, of course, to form a kind of glue to where they do actually have a common family. They are all interconnected by being within the heartland, and within that, they've all got their place. They've all got their sense of being. They're all spiritually at peace, and all of this kind of thing. They're not going to be disturbed. They're going to be protected from the changes and the endless. Let's go back to what I was saying about the water flowing. They're not going to have that. They're going to remain rooted, and they're going to be watched over. It's going to be illiberal. fundamentally an illiberal way of looking at it. And on the one hand, you can think, yeah, this is a kind of sort of theory cell kind of intellectualism. It's got Heidegger baked in there and everything. But at the same time, it's also just pragmatism when you look at the threats and you look at the idea of Prometheism, as you call it, where we will break it all apart. It kind of ticks both of those boxes on sort of consolidating the heartland, but without actually sort of forcing everybody to have one ideology, as say what happened with communism or whatever. But it does seem a bit convoluted and complicated.
Well, just to add credence to everything you said, because it's very interesting. Dugan, I believe, because we already brought up Spengler, introduced by the idea of Russia's cultural pseudomorphosis, the idea that Russia is basically in a state of, or at least during the 19th century, in a state of arrested civilization, that Russia's civilization hadn't emerged of whatever it was supposed to be. Then we talk about Dugan, talk about the fourth theory, and he brings up Heidegger, and I believe he misapplies the concept of Dasein, which is beingness, which is, at its most simple level, it's being which is self-aware. But of course, within that whole notion, you then apply it to Russia, and it becomes basically Heideggerian apologetics for what Putin refers to as Russia as, which is a civilization state, which is, okay, well, I'm not going to be enamored of this overly theoretical approach by someone like Dugan. I'm instead going to apply to history, effectively, as the common thing that binds us all together. And thank you for your words regarding my my Ukraine video, because the reason I brought that up and the reason why I focused on the futility of peace in Ukraine is because I don't believe you can create a top-down theoretical straitjacket for Russia to fit into. You mentioned the example of a fusion of the Orthodox and Islamic parties within Russia. Mentioned the idea of being that self-aware. Well, of course, self-aware to the point of view that it just understands that it's nothing more than a deconstruction of national identity. And then you take this further and apply it to someone like Ukraine. Ukraine has more reason than most places in Russia, like I said, to have historical connection to Muscovy. And so it's been a great success, you can say, of modern Ukrainian nation building and identitarianism, sectarianism, to find a way, a contrived means of separating Moscow from true Russian civilization and making them separate from one another. So it's, you can say it's a supreme and naive form of idealism to believe that groups which are far more ethnically and religiously distinct, like, say, for example, the Tatars of Kazan, can be appropriated into Russian civilization, which has been made a nonsense of when you compare it to the conflict between Ukraine and Russia today. But you're correct in basically the assumption that it is a means of keeping the heartland together, which is, I'm going to flip this argument on its head again and say that I have a very unpopular view among a lot of people who are sympathetic towards the Tsar of Russia. It's part of the reason why, even though I'm enamored and love Russian history, my views are more rooted in a concern for the truth, and I have no time for apologetics of any form. And so I believe, I'm one of the very few people who believes that along with Sean McMeekin, a very capable historian who I've referenced in this channel before, that Russia has most of the blame involved in the original creation of the conflagration of World War I over the Serbian crisis. And it's interesting again that Mackinder talks about this war as a liberation of the Slav peoples against the German populations. And I believe that's significant because I actually believe it betrays something which is far more insidious. I'm going to bring this back to this idea of perfidious Albion, Semigog. The idea that the Tsar pursued I would say, an overtly pan-Slavic ideology, a aggressive expansionist pan-Slavic nationalism, compared to what something, say, for example, like Dugan would advocate, which would be familiarity and civilizational cooperation with non-ethnic sort of Slavic groups and Christian groups. But instead, this was the nationalism that entailed the dismantling of the Ottoman Empire, the dismantling of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the annexation of the Polish regions of Prussia. If we're going to take that, then doesn't it seem that Pan-Slavism is just a tool by which we can see the Heartland theory being enacted against the interests of Germany and Russia, to pit these two civilizations against each other, to de-Germanize the Russian Empire, meaning to create the friction between the Slavic and the German populations, something that was, again, done over when we talk about World War II, except pitted from the other side. Now it's the Germans wanting to expand up to the Volga. It's the Germans looking for Lebensraum. In other words, these ideologies of supranationalism, you can say, are actually informing part of British political thinking, because it keeps these nations pitted against each other. Beyond, you can say, another ideological lens that you can apply to World War II, but not World War I, which is the idea of National Socialism versus communism at the same time. We have to create not just ethnic juxtapositions between the Heartland and the various regions that we would be concerned of allying with them, but we also have to create ideological, ethnic, existential struggles between them. I just find that quite fascinating to consider.